Rob, I think, and I don't want to say like the sports world is rocked, right? Like John Madden, honestly, had been pretty much, I think, out of the minds of most NFL fans in terms of watching football for a long time, right? It's been a minute since he broadcast a game. That said, between the Madden documentary, which came out
Christmas Day,
right? And the fact that kids still play Madden when John Madden dies at the age of 85, it's one of those moments where I do think that our job, and this is where it's hard to be, and I've been really young in this job. When you started in this job a long time ago.
I was 22 years old at the Daily News in New York, Doug, 1986, so I've been around for a minute.
Right, but the point is, it's really hard when you're young, and I think I was fortunate when I was a kid that my dad was, whether or not his history and his recollection. Remember, part of it is me parroting what I heard from my dad for a long time, as well as what I read. But it's really hard when you're in your 20s and you're a broadcaster to give true perspective on it. I have enough perspective on Madden. And I know, and again, part of it is me, and like my entire life, I grew up playing the video game. Matter of fact, I actually talked about it yesterday on my own show, which was I can't compete with my son right now in Madden. My son's 12, and he does the practice stuff some, but I can't even get to halftime without wanting to shut the game off.
Wow.
He's that much.
I'm of the age where I've never played Madden ever. I've never even touched the thing.
Of the versions of it, I've played all but maybe one or two, right?
Wow.
Where there's one or two. And I used to, when I first got into broadcasting, I'm in my mid-20s. I'm 26 years old, whatever. I used to play it. I used to get it when it first came out. And one of the things it was good for was updating on who was where. Right. Obviously, all the big guys, but you got to know all the defensive players. And I would before I had kids, I would sit around and play video games. And one of the things I would convince myself of is if I could play every team, it would help me with my recollection of who was on what team. Right. I didn't like to go through every roster any other way. That one just worked for me. And the last couple of years, they've had the live updating of rosters and other information, so it's even better. But John Madden dies last night at the age of 85. And you and I, we had the same thought, which was, what was yours?
Was that nobody really knows what a great coach he was. And we all know about the broadcast and the four networks. And I remember him with what I consider the best broadcasting team. And maybe it's just because I was a kid and more impressionable, but Pat Summerall and John Madden on CBS, that to me was the standard, like those two guys doing football. And obviously they moved over to Fox, and then he worked with Al Michaels, who's a great broadcaster as well. But I always think of John Madden and Pat Summerall. But this dude was an unbelievable coach. A young coach, we talk about the Sean McVays or whatever. John Madden was that guy at 32. He was. And the difference is John Madden was great for his 10 years as a coach with the Raiders and won a Super Bowl, had a winning, never had a losing record, and made the playoffs 8 out of 10, has the highest winning percentage of any coach in NFL history that has at least 100 games coached. I mean, he was truly dynamic. And when I think about Oakland at that time, too, Doug, he was a part. Oakland is now beat up, and nobody talks about Oakland, and they lost their football team, they lost their basketball team. They're going to lose
football team twice.
Exactly, they're going to lose their baseball team probably to Las Vegas as well, and now it's a wasteland. But back in the 70s, when John Madden won the Super Bowl with the Raiders in '77. That was a sports mecca. The Warriors and Rick Barry won a championship in '75. The Oakland A's had a great team with Reggie Jackson and guys like that, Joe Rudy, and those guys won 3 World Series in a row, 72, 73, 74. Warriors won in 75, and the Raiders won in 77. So Oakland was a sports hotbed, and John Madden was a big part of that.
It really, though, is amazing. It's like Madden with the video games is George Foreman with the grill.
Yep.
You know, where
that's a good way of looking at it.
Something you do in terms of an endorsement that becomes so powerful, we forget about all the other stuff. And I think, obviously, Foreman coming back and being the oldest heavyweight champion, reinvigorated he was a great boxer. But in terms of the first version of George Foreman, and he kind of totally remade himself. The one thing about Madden that's different than a George Foreman is he didn't really remake himself. He was always that guy. Like, his personality didn't change. It didn't become a TV personality. It was kind of one guy. But yes, I knew he was a great coach. I had forgotten it was at 32 he became a head coach,
right?
And the consistency of complete dominance, and whether or not it was a different era or how much you want to credit Al Davis or whatever, all of the different, he was great in everything he did, right? He was great as a coach. He was great as a broadcaster, and he was great as a endorser. He was a very, very unique guy who, but the video game helped him stay relevant. And
the story about that, right, was the guys who invented it waited outside the press entrance or whatever and said that they wanted to put his name on it. Like, it's not people, he didn't invent it or anything. They just I think
right.
you mentioned the George Foreman grill. They offered that to who's the wrestler? Oh my God, Hulk Hogan first.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
It was offered to him. He wasn't interested in it, and can you imagine kicking himself later? And it was just, hey, you want to put your name on this grill, and then they sold a gazillion grills, and George Foreman made a ton of money. They had to wind up making a deal with him because of the amount of money he was making off of it.
That reminds me of when we were at the other place. A good friend of mine, John Anderson, Sports Center.
Sure.
You remember he did Wipeout. But
yep.
the story that Scott Van Pelt had told when he used to have a radio show was, maybe Russillo told this story, was they called Van Pelt first and offered him Wipeout. And he was like, it kind of sounds like a Japanese game show, sort of. Mm-hmm. And they're like, that's exactly what it's going to be like, going to be silly like that. He's like, yeah, I'm going to pass. I mean, John Anderson is going to go out to his mailbox for the rest of his life and get a healthy check from that show Wipeout.
No doubt. That's sometimes when people pass up stuff, like even Hulk Hogan, you're doing, and all due respect, but you're a fake wrestler. Like, a grill is beneath
but it also
you.
It also speaks to just how big those guys were, right? Like, I remember when I was a kid, I flew cross country. I was probably about my son's age, 11 or 12. And I had my late uncle. He lived in Stamford, Connecticut, and I spent winter break with him one year, with him and his family. And I remember getting on a plane, and it was, you're like a junior, say, like walkie to the gate or whatever. I'd flown plenty. And Hulk Hogan was on our plane in first class. And you would have thought the Pope or Jesus or the President of the United States, was getting on the plane. Like, that's how big Hulk Hogan was. So yes, I agree. And Hogan's there's another interesting one or whatever. But yes, guys pass on stuff all the time.
Yep.
Then there's other guys that never pass on anything.
No, we know those guys as well. They were on everything. I mean, Shaq's on everything. I mean, how many endorsements?
But now Shaq's deal is Shaq takes equity. That's his deal. Don't pay me, or if you're going to pay me a little bit, pay me less.
Right.
Give me some equity, and that's how he's built
everything.
Brilliant. He's built up his empire that way.
No doubt. But John Madden was a, and when you talk about coaches, like great coaches in the history of the NFL, his name never comes up. Like, never. It's about Bill Belichick, Vince Lombardi, of course. Who else am I thinking?
I don't know if Lombardi comes up. I think the modern era of football, it's just like. It's like basketball.
Well, the trophy.
We don't say Red Auerbach's name.
Yeah, you might be right. Maybe
I
guess I hear his name more because of the trophy. You know what I mean? Like, his name is still out there, and you're right. Probably.
Well, his name's on a stadium as well, right?
Right.
No, it's not on a stadium. I'm trying the Lambeau. Why I say Lombardi? That was a major brain.
But the trophy, right?
Yes, the Lombardi Award. I think NFL films. Although I'm not sure. how much NFL films is going to affect kids anymore. Like they just don't watch. Like they'll watch. I don't know if that's what we've kind of changed in how what football is about. Part of what made NFL films so great, and what made the Hank Strams, and what made was some of the Lombardi stuff, whatever, is that was the only one that was the first. That was like the first mic'd up type of stuff. That was the only insight. But you didn't have anything else the rest of the week. Like
No.
now you have everybody covers the NFL all the time. There's shows and a network completely dedicated to the NFL. So your thirst for NFL, your thirst for what really goes on was there, and now you don't have it as much. But
Right. If you think about it, just talking about that aspect, for most, and people probably can't, believe it, but the only time we saw games out of our market or not our home teams, Doug, was on Monday Night Football when Howard Cosell did the highlights around the entire league. It was must-see TV. That was the only way you could see the Rams or the 49ers highlights or anything outside of, and me growing up in New York, Jets or Giants stuff was on Monday Night Football. And it was must-see. It was just not the same now where you have access to everything. And you could be a fan of any team because you could actually see back then, if you lived in New York, for the most part, you were a New York fan, right? Because you just didn't have access to the other teams or information that you would need to be a fan.
Well, it's interesting. This is Howard Cosell. I used to do that when I was a kid. Announce my own games when I was shooting outside. But when you grew up in Southern California, and my dad was a New Yorker, so he's a Giant fan. There used to be sports bars where you could go and get the Giants games, or you had to go get the big satellite dish. And one of the things I think most people don't understand, because they didn't live in Los Angeles for the last 25 years before, when there was 20 years when there's no NFL team, is it actually was kind of a breath of fresh air, because a lot of people were not Raider fans, right? Raiders are still the most popular team in LA. Okay, and I grew up in Orange County where the Rams played, but they weren't super popular because most people were from somewhere else. So when they moved away in the early 90s, the NFL wasn't as popular as it is now. And I know you're not talking about the 70s and 80s.
No, it wasn't. The second largest market didn't have a football team for 20
right, but
years.
I actually think it helped grow the popularity in LA because you had the best games on. You had 2 games on in every window.
Right, I know what you're saying.
So people were like, well, how come the Chargers go? Because so many people or their parents moved here from a different place and they were fans of that place. But also, you got to watch all of the good games. So the reason there's so many Steeler fans in Los Angeles is not just because people from Pennsylvania moved out to California. It's because the Steelers were good for the most part for 20 years. So all of their games were on in Southern California, right? That's kind of the magic to it. Was there's lots of football fans. They're just not football fans of the Chargers, who are a rival, or the Rams, who, even though they won in St. Louis, they weren't really popular. And so it's different. But getting back to it, John Madden dies at the age of 85, and as Rob pointed out, that was the only thing I tweeted about was his record. Like there's some McVay to it because he was so young.
Yep.
There's some Rex Ryan. He was Rex Ryan before Rex Ryan in terms of the quotes and how you couldn't wait to hear what he was going to say before or after the game. And then the consistency of excellence brings you thoughts of whether it's a Belichick or, pick the guy who's been able to go a decade where he not only didn't have you almost undersell it when you say he didn't have a losing season. He didn't have close to a losing season.
Right.
That's how good the guy was.
I would take him over Bill Belichick, and only from this standpoint. Bill Belichick obviously coached even way longer and has won 6 championships. But, when you really, if you're honest and you look through Bill Belichick's career, it's checkered. There's no way around it. You can't look at it. He had the biggest fine of any NFL coach ever for Spygate. There's all these allegations and things swirling around the organization. It's the reason. And people say, well, everybody hates the Patriots because they win too much. I get that, right? People always hated the Yankees and teams that won. But there's something where you just can't feel good about it. Like another shoe is going to drop at some point. And when you talk about the Patriots and their run, and you talk to the St. Louis Rams when they lost the Super Bowl, they swear up and down that the Patriots knew their plays, and there's just an element of cheating there where you talk about John Madden. There's none of that. There's just this guy was a damn good football coach, and he won.